Hey, Laszlo. It's Peter, and I've got the pictures here of your calligraphy script, silk scroll. This is a really good item. Very, very collectible. It's a nice one. They began doing these in the late Qing dynasty and the early Republic period, but there was a real interest in them, and there are people today that love these and collect them. You'll look at if you examine it up close, you'll notice that the silkwork on these are outstandingly well done, and they of course formed a script. Some of them I really can't make out, but that's not uncommon with these. It appears to be some sort of partial hallmark dedication mark with a rain. The first character is great, and then something like Qing or Great Qing Scroll something. This character doesn't read. I can't read that at all. It's just a clump of flowers. But at any rate, it's beautifully mounted. It's got some edge wear to the sides, but this kind of fabric they often used as backing. This silk and sometimes this is silk and wool ground. Sometimes it's silk on silk. Sometimes it's silk with metallic thread. But you have this nice sort of brownish apricot background that's actually in quite good shape with the calligraphy going down it in floral form, which makes this This is a really nice example. You don't see these very often because they were so susceptible to damage. But this one looks like it's in quite good shape, and in a well advertised auction. It would probably sell for somewhere in the $1,200 to $2,000 range, maybe more. If someone can ascribe it to a particular school of silkwork or a particular maker, which they do have some access to increasingly with these. They've done a lot of research on these types of scrolls. Sometimes they have images of people in silk with the calligraphy down the side as well. But this is just a pure calligraphy one, but it's very nice. It's very, very, very nice. In a retail shop, in a fancy gallery, in London or New York or Hong Kong, a scroll like this would probably be between $4,000 and $6,000. But in an auction, on the lower end, figure $1,200 to $2,000, but possibly more, possibly $2,500 or so. But retail is a different story. So unless you're opening a shop somewhere with a lot of foot traffic for Chinese art, there's no point in really worrying about that. But it's a very, very, very nice scroll. Late Qing, early Republic, 1890s, 1900, up to about 1920, 1925. But take good care of it. Be nice to it. Keep it rolled up. Don't hang it in a sunny window. You can hang it. You can put it up. But just keep in mind that heavy silks like this, the weight hanging, if it's hung for a very prolonged period of time, will start to pull the thing apart. You can hang it for short periods, for a week or two here and there, once a year or something, but I wouldn't leave this hanging all the time. The silk will get brittle, and it'll start to tear itself apart. Scrolls were never meant to be, in China when they were first made, typically scrolls were not meant to be hung on a permanent basis. They would be put out for special occasions. They'd be put out to share with people, holidays, things like that, and then they put them away because they are so susceptible to climate changes in the house, heat, moisture, insects, all that stuff. But this one has been very well cared for in general, and you got a treasure. It's a good one. All right? Enjoy it. It's a nice thing. Bye-bye. Hello, Pavlovus. How are you? I've got the pictures here of your couple of frame pieces, or little. They're sort of decoupage. They're quite exceptional, and I want to go over it with you because you've got something that's very nice, aesthetically and historically. Here it is. You have two of these. They're slightly different. This is a figural landscape scene, and what's interesting about it is that part of it is done in watercolor on either silk or some sort of heavy cotton. I can't really tell from the pictures. It looks like it's probably a coarse silk. And then it's overlaid with carved soapstone and possibly bits of ivory. I noticed on a couple of them there's some areas that are pretty white down in here. And this might be ivory. It could be soapstone, but the crack, and so it looks like it's probably ivory, which is very interesting, and maybe some dyed ivory. So a combination of soapstone and dyed ivory, which they did do. They did this kind of work, but they didn't do it often. As the back of the thing says, here is that it indicates that it was made during the sort of the middle to early part of the 19th century, and I agree with that. I think it was most likely made during probably the later part of the Jiaqing to early Daoguan period. This is a really nice old thing aesthetically. I love the artwork. It's done very much in the manner of classical Chinese paintings of the 18th century and earlier. The way the figures are depicted, the way the buildings are done, they're very three-dimensional looking, nice architectural elements and so forth. You have this very nice sort of scholarly rock coming out of the ground. And so forth, young man proposing or wooing a young woman and all that. It's very interesting, very nice. And then you have the next one, which isn't inscribed on the back, which is a figure standing in a moon window or a moon gate window, moon window they call them, these big round windows. There's a very famous painting of the Emperor Yongchen sitting in front of a window just like this, incidentally. But at any rate, again, equally well done. A little less decoupage or a little less overlay work of stones and ivory, but still very nicely done. You have a slight loss down in here. This, according to the paperwork, I guess you said this had been restored at the East Russian Museum, or they had examined it anyway. And I would leave all this alone, unless you have somebody who's a real pro at piecing those things back on. Because these things are very delicate. It's done on probably on silk, and then it's clad onto this sort of paper backing of some kind, matte backing, or paper, perhaps like a paper mache type backing. But these are really nice. They measure roughly 6 by 8 inches, the site size, and they made these nifty little frames for them. One of the frames I noticed came off at one point. Here you have it here, and then there you have it without the frames on it. So I guess it slips on or slips off. I would put it back on. I would leave it on there, and then what I would do with this is I would take this whole piece and put it inside of a frame and put some museum glass over the front of it to protect the surface from the air. A good framer will seal the back of it. They'll mount it on a good backing. They'll put a fillet around it of some kind, or maybe you could have it suspended, and then put it under museum glass, or at least some kind of glass. Museum glass is best because it has no reflection and does a pretty good job of, does a very good job of sealing up the picture. Because you want to seal it up from the environment. You don't want temperature changes in the house hitting it and so forth. This is true with all watercolors. That's why you typically, when you see watercolors, whether they're made in China or they're made in the West, they always put them under glass. And the reason is that you don't want the paper and the pigments and so forth exposed to any more air than they have to be, because it degrades, it breaks down and helps degrade the paper. And it will preserve it very nicely. These are handsome, very attractive, very interesting, and very well done aesthetically. There's a very nice aesthetic to these from an artistic standpoint, the way they're composed. And these are fairly rare. So if you look them up, you're not going to find a lot of price comps for them. If you go to Sotheby's or Bonhams or Christie's, if you dig around for a while, you might find something like it, or find maybe a small table screen that has some of this kind of work in it, or it's done on lacquer. Often the most common way to find this kind of work is not on silk or on paper that's been painted, but they'll overlay the stuff onto lacquer backgrounds, red lacquer or black lacquer typically, and then maybe some decoration on the lacquer, like these areas here, where they would incise and color in areas. But anyway, that's what it is, and like I said, it was made during safely during the first half of the 19th century, probably late Jiaqing to early Daoguan period, so 1815 to 1830, somewhere around there, 1835 maybe, in my opinion. And they're very, very nice, and the value of them, they're probably worth somewhere in the area of $400 to $600 a piece, maybe $500 to $700 each. And as a pair, I would expect them in an auction to bring somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. They bring a little bit of a premium because there's two of them, and it's a complementary pair, because you have this one and then you have this one, and they would look very, very nice together. But like I said, I would get them framed. I would get them under glass. I would get the back sealed up to keep air from getting onto them, keep the air away, and put them in a room without any direct sunlight ever touching them. Direct sunlight will eat the pigment up on this like crazy. It won't eat up the blue, but it'll eat up all the other colors. So, and weaken them. But I would preserve this. This is well worth preserving. It's a very, very nice objects. Two very nice objects. Okay, enjoy them. And look around for some others. It's an interesting collecting category, incidentally. This kind of oddball, these are sort of oddball crafts that the Chinese did for different reasons. And it really shows the versatility and how they could work with so many different mediums, putting them together and doing creative things with them and doing them very artistically. The way the faces are done here, this work, all this is very, very nice work. Beautiful carving. Whoever the carver was a pro. This is super duper carving. And then you have this cracked ice pattern emulating or simulating stone walls. And then you have brickwork in here that's very three-dimensional looking, even though it's flat. And that takes enormous skill. We take it for granted looking at it visually, but it takes a lot of skill to be able to do these structures like this effectively, so that they give a three-dimensional perspective, like a shadow box almost. So there you are. All right, have a good week, and thanks for sending it. I like these a great deal. I think they're terrific. All right, bye-bye. Hey, Ron, it's Peter, and I've got your inquiry here, and I read your questions on this Imari and this piece that you bought, which was at the Fortune Auction Gallery down in Texas in Plano, just closed the other day on the 22nd. It's a nice plate. The estimate was ridiculous. The estimate was just, I don't know what they were thinking of. I think they added too many zeros when they were writing in the estimate, because 300 to 500 would be completely accurate. 3 to 5,000 for one of these is not. Now, as to what this plate is a Kangxi plate, and it was probably made during the latter part of the 17th century, somewhere in there. It's very nicely done. It's a well-known pattern that we've seen before, and you paid a perfectly reasonable price for it. Okay, that's all there is to it. And then you were asking in sort of its relation to Imari. Well, it is and it isn't. It's a piece of export ware. It has some Imari colors in it, but technically this wouldn't qualify as Chinese Imari. It would just be Chinese with a little bit of looks like underglazed red on it. That's not overglazed. That appears to be underglazed, which is rather nice. It's rather nicely done. You don't see a lot of that from this period, so it's a good-looking plate and a reasonable price. All right, and then over here to these are over on Ruby Lane, and they're advertised as Japanese antique shoki Imari dishes with a Fuku mark, Edo period Japan. They're not really shoki. Shoki Imari refers specifically to plates or porcelains made between 1630 and 1650. Once it goes after that, then it's something else. Okay, you seem to have some. You were wondering about what's the earliest Imari. The Chinese or the Japanese, the history of Imari. So, I have these here. It's sort of a good opportunity to run through it. One of the things I would recommend you do is pick up a copy of, if you don't have it already, a copy of this book. And mine is rather dog-eared because I bought it when it came out, and it's a little dodgy. But Porcelain for Palaces. It's got several very good sections going through and explaining the history of Imari and so forth, because the early Imari was almost immediately shipped to Europe. It was exported. It was made as an export thing, and it went out very, very quickly. And the other book I would recommend is this. Barry Davies. He was a dealer in Oriental art. Barry Davies Oriental art, and this is Ko-Imari porcelain from the collection of Oliver M. Pei, who is very well known. You probably know who he is, but I don't know if you have the book or not. He was the keeper of ceramics, I think at the Ashmolean or the British Museum. He held many positions. And he was a giant collector of early Japanese porcelains, and in particular Imari wares. And he built this great collection. He had an unusual deal. I read a story about it once, that he was allowed to. Usually, museum curators aren't allowed to buy things, but he had a special sort of deal, as I recall, where he could buy things. I think it was in that book, actually. He could buy things that the museums didn't want to buy. So if he brought something to the museum board and they said no to it, he could buy it himself for his own collection. It was sort of a funny system. Today, they'd be fired on the spot for doing stuff like that. Most museums have prohibitions on it. But at any rate, the earliest Japanese porcelain was made around 1590 in the Arita area. And I believe the clay was actually discovered by the porcelain clay was actually discovered by a Korean potter living there. But at any rate, the very, very first pieces. And they didn't make a lot of it up until about 1630, late 1620s. They began producing more and more of it. And most of that was all blue and white. That was all blue and white, but it was exported out of the port of Imari, which was a shipping area in Japan and Kyushu. So they could just called it Imari. They just called it Imari ware, and it was it's the way they refer to other things, Canton ware or something based on the port of export. It has nothing to do with where it was actually made. It just has to do with the port of. Doesn't always have anything to do with where it was made. It was just the port where it was shipped from. So these aren't shoki Imari. These look like 18th century dishes from what I'm seeing. They're very nicely done, but they're not shoki Imari. The price is even reasonable, $175 a piece when you're getting a pair, and they're both in excellent condition. And what do they measure? About 10 inches in diameter, 7 inches? 7.25 inches in diameter. It's not a bad deal. It's not a bad deal. You might be able to get a little better price if you negotiate with them. It's always a good idea. But at any rate, so what happened was, when the Japanese first began producing blue and white and shipping out of the Imari area, made in Arita, shipping it out of Imari. And that was 1630 to 1650. And then around 1670 or so, the Kakiemon palette was evolved and began being used on early porcelains there. And the Kakiemon palette, which is very different from a color standpoint and stylistic standpoint than what we think of today as Japanese Imari enamels. Not Japanese Imari blue and white, but Japanese Imari enamels, which were often applied onto plates that had originally been decorated in underglazed blue and then later added the colors added to them for a second firing, or third firing. So that's sort of the pecking order. And around the same time, the Chinese around 1700 began producing what many refer to as Imari colored wares, Kangxi Imari wares. So it really followed back off of the Japanese work that had already been done or already begun to be done. And curiously, the Japanese got the idea, this is where it gets confusing, the Japanese, they believe, got the idea of using these enamels in this manner from late Ming examples, which they had already been copying, the famous Wan Li copies, the VOC plates and all that, that looks a lot like Chinese work, but are all Japanese. So there was this period where the Japanese were making blue and white wares early on. They were emulating and copying in many ways late Ming wares and of blue and white. Then they began adding enamels, and then they began which were the Kakiemon. And then they got the idea by looking at some of the enamel wares done on wucai decoration from the late Ming period, and began adopting that color palette in the latter part of the 16th century and into the early 17th century. And then the Japanese came back into the market and began sort of copying the evolved color palette that the Japanese had brought in. Not copying directly from their own Chinese later Ming wares, but copying what the Japanese were doing. So there was a lot, and it was all because they were all competing to have a share of the export market. It was all about commerce, economics. It's always with us, and it was always an issue back then, competing between the markets. If the Dutch were kicked out of China, they would go to Japan, and they would ask the Japanese to make what the Chinese had been making for them that were so popular in Europe, and the Japanese were happy to do it. And that is sort of how it went. And then in time, of course, the British were in China during the Kangxi period, and they were exporting wares out of there. The Dutch were in Japan getting export wares, and that was how this whole confluence got going. So it was both countries influenced the other. In sort of overlapping, sort of leapfrogging ways up through the 17th century, from the beginning of the 17th century onward, right up until the end of the Kangxi period. So there was this sort of one following the other in their efforts and in their anxieties to maintain market share. So that's the sort of the whole story of it. It's a very interesting topic of discussion. There's often a lot of confusion about were the Japanese Imari potters copying Chinese Imari. Well, not really. The Japanese were actually doing it first, but only by a few years. There was a very close timeline between them when you're talking about enamel wares. But the Japanese were making very good blue and white wares during the late Ming period and into the transitional period. Those are the earliest pieces, and some of them are unbelievably refined, and certainly on a par with anything being produced in China at the time, probably better. But it's an area that often gets overlooked because these days, especially because the Chinese market has sort of sucked all the oxygen out of the room on a lot of this stuff, and people are paying only attention to Chinese wares because the values are so high. So, but for the collectors. It's for true collectors, is what I'm referring to, people that really enjoy this stuff and not just interested for the financial aspects. It's a very fascinating history for about 100 years, or 80 to 100 years, what was going on in that period. So it was Japanese, then Chinese, then Japanese, sort of back and forth. All right, have a good week, and thanks for sending it in. If you have any more questions, let me know. Bye-bye.